Well, the book is an exploration of what the Second World War did to families and how the memory of the war has been communicated from generation to generation and how we live with it today, basically. And at the same time that it is a search into my own family, into trying to find out who my grandparents were and what they did or didn't do under the Nazi regime. It's also a search for German cultural identity, because I feel that the Second World War and the Nazi regime still defines our understanding of who we are as Germans in my generation to a great degree. So it's a search both for my family and for German cultural identity, and a reflection on what war does to people over the course of generations.
But why you? I mean, you were born in 1977, and there was a generation that kind of neglected what had happened, but ever since kind of the 60s, later the Holocaust series, kind of people have recognized that there is an issue here that we have to remember. Today we're in 2019, so why did you take up this issue?
I think for me it was a combination of different moments that I experienced in my life. I mean, I think it probably started with my school education, where we learned a lot about the Holocaust and where we were taken on field trips to concentration camp museums. So that started my inner reflection, just along with all my other school friends, probably. But then moving abroad, I've been living on and off abroad for about 20 years. And I realized that living as a German abroad, I'm not only a representative of my own or my own family, but also of my country, and therefore of my country's political past. And with that comes a feeling of responsibility, and also the realization that there were many questions I didn't know how to answer. Questions that probably wouldn't have come up if I had stayed in Germany, because when you live amongst people whose families were equally involved as your own family, you don't feel compelled to question exactly what it was your family did or didn't do under the Nazi regime. So being a stranger or a German amongst non-Germans really led to this urge of exploring the question from a new perspective. And I think the way I had dealt with it previously was mostly on a universal level. The way that we spoke about it in school was very much on a collective level. And I think Germany has done a great deal of memorializing and reflecting on a collective level. But I think what we were lacking were the personal tools that would have allowed us to investigate and take individual responsibility. And so that was my goal with the book, was to go back and ask those individual personal questions that allowed me to reflect more on this question of inherited guilt or responsibility. I'm an illustrator by training, so I never thought about writing the book without illustrations or without images. And I also thought a lot about memory. And memory is such a highly visual thing. We don't remember only in words. I mean, we have highly visual brains, obviously, and the war especially. We have a lot of associations with images, and also associations that are inherited. I mean, even if you haven't fought in a war, you somehow picture it in a particular way because of the culture you grew up in or because of the films you've watched. So there's a strong visual component that we attach to history and how we perceive history, and how that perception is conveyed from generation to generation. And so I thought that images are an important part of telling a history. And I decided not to stick to the traditional graphic novel format, because I wanted to free myself from the rigid, speech bubble and panel format. I wanted to do something freer. I also thought that I could probably be looser and therefore more poetic with a freer format. And so that's why I decided to combine full-page illustrations with comic pages, with photographs, and with found objects. And I also thought that integrating graphic elements that I found at archives while doing my research would convey a stronger authenticity to the reader, because I think it's very different hearing somebody write or reading somebody write about finding something in an archive than actually seeing the actual document that the person who describes the document saw or held in their hands themselves. And that's why I decided to use this collage feel in my book. And I also thought a lot about the collage-like or fragmentary nature of memory, because to me history is an accumulation of individually experienced moments in time that we then make sense of in retrospect. And we tend to think of it as a linear thing, because that's how we learn about it in school and in history school books. But in reality, I think it's a very fragmentary thing that we then construct into a narrative. And so I wanted to convey that idea of a fragmentation in the visual style of the book. I think from a visual point of view, keeping the balance between comic style and more realistically drawn images was sometimes challenging, because it's a book about a heavy subject. But again, I mean, I try to shed light on the German war experience in a more complex way, and I think there are complex emotions evolved, and some are heavier and some are lighter, and hopefully that is conveyed through the different visual styles. But one thing that I was really troubled about from the beginning was, you know, when you tell a story about the war experience from the German perspective, the biggest danger is that you become sentimental, or that you convey this idea that you're victimizing the Germans, or that you're trying to make an apology. And that is really obviously not what I wanted to do. I mean, my book was an attempt for me to understand better who we are as Germans, who I am as a German, and what my responsibility is. And so when you work with images and also with sound, sometimes you very quickly get into a sentimental realm. And I used landscape photography a lot in the book, because I didn't want to be too literal and show myself in each of the panels or each of the pages, because I saw the book from the beginning more as a passive portrait and more as an inner reflection or an inner landscape. And so when I chose landscape photography, I thought of them more as emotional landscapes of myself and of the emotions I was going through at a particular moment in time. And so when I went through different landscape images that I had collected at flea markets in Germany, there were many I felt I couldn't use, because, you know, some had like a sunset on them, for instance, and that would have been so inappropriate, because that would have, even if I hadn't evoked it in the text, the image in combination with the text would have evoked a sense of sentimentality, and that's something a German can't do. I mean, German films about war can only have a particular kind of music. It's a very, very thin line to tread on. And so it was something I had to really reflect very, very carefully on. Well, I spent 2 years researching, 2 years writing, and 2 years illustrating. And the 2 years I was researching, I researched on many different levels. I went into local archives, hoping that I would find any mentioning of names from my family in the mayor's letters or in any other documents that existed. But I also went back to the village where my father grew up and did some field research and interviewed older residents who still knew some of my family members. And so the research took place on many different levels, and it took me a while to piece it all together. And I think one of the most important moments during the research was when I went to my hometown's archive and found my maternal grandfather's US military file, which was a file that contained a questionnaire that every German over the age of 18 years old had to fill out under the American sector that would provide information about what they did or didn't do under the Nazi regime. And based on the answers you gave, you were ranked into 5 different categories that ranged from major war criminal to follower to victim under the regime. And then you were given punishment based on that ranking. And so finding his file that had been compiled 70 years ago and that he had filled out with his blue fountain pen, and reading his answers was such a uncomfortable but also enlightening and intimate moment that brought me closer to him, because it felt like he was finally answering the questions that I had burning to ask him, you know, for 30 years and couldn't because he died before I learned about the Holocaust.
And were you, because you grew up in a time where there was openness towards the Holocaust and where it was not a taboo anymore to ask those questions, it was difficult to ask your own grandparents and parents, but it was not like in the 50s where you shouldn't speak about it. Were you still surprised, or did you find a difference between kind of this public openness and what you kind of discovered for your own? Was there a discrepancy there?
Not so much in my own family. I think there's a discrepancy in the general society that you know, people very much acknowledge that what happened was utterly terrible and unforgivable, and that we need to memorialize it and talk about it. But going back into one's own family is a very different thing, and also depends on, you know, whether certain family members are still alive or not. I mean, the people I focused on in my book had all died, and so I think that made it easier for me to ask those questions. But I was also lucky because I'm very close to my family, and they were very open from the beginning to the project, to my research, and they wanted to find out as much as I found out. And it was only interesting to me how they then dealt with whatever I found out. And so, for instance, when I found out that my maternal grandfather was a member of the Nazi Party, everybody in my family was really shocked and surprised. Partly because he had always voted for the Social Democrats, which is the Democratic Party in Germany, and which still exists, and which also was the biggest political enemy of the Nazis. But also because only 15% of all Germans were party members, and I say only in quotation marks because the Nazis put a stop on admissions quite early on in 1933. So it wasn't like people didn't want to join. But it was interesting to me to see how differently my mother responded to the way my aunt responded. And my mother basically immediately said that she always thought my grandfather had been a bit of a coward. And my aunt was more defensive. I mean, she was also shocked when she found out, but she tried to see things from his perspective more. And I think it was partly because her relationship when he was still alive was a much more complicated relationship than my mother's relationship with her father. So I think it was probably in a way of making amends. And so that was, to me, again, a perfect example for how the personal and the political intersect. I think she was more defensive of his decisions because their relationship was much more difficult and she can't make up for it.
Would you say that of course the Holocaust happened in Germany, but there are voices saying the Holocaust actually is also an expression of what humans can do to humans. So we should all learn from the Holocaust. Would you state that the Holocaust, besides that it happened in Germany, has a special German notification?
Well, I think it will always be particular culturally because it happened in Germany and because unfortunately we associate, looking at Germany from the outside, we associate its language sometimes with what happened. We're repeatedly, the language is used in films about the war, especially, the entertainment industry tends to reflect on the war in a very particular way that's not always showing us the gray zone of the German war experience. So I think that you can't ever separate it from German identity, but that doesn't mean that it's a problem that's specific to Germany, of course. I don't think, I think it could have happened in other countries. I mean, there have been genocides before and after the Holocaust in other countries, and the hope is that my book is also, that there's a universal quality to it, because if I learned anything from the book, from working on the book, it is that the past doesn't exist outside the present. We are who we are because of what was before. We are made of the past, and therefore we all have the responsibility to acknowledge the past and to face up to it, and not only to those moments that were glorious moments in our country's histories, but everything. And in America, that would be, the history of slavery or what happened to the Native Americans. And we have the responsibility to understand how what's happening now, the injustices that are happening now in our countries, are directly connected to what we did wrong in the past. And that's something that's universal to any country, obviously.
Living here in Brooklyn, going back to Germany once in a while, how do you look at your own country today? Because there are voices saying that Germany is, because of its history, has learned. Do you agree?
I think we have, as a country, deeply reflected on what happened, but I also think we need to continue to reflect on it. I think especially now that we're experiencing a generational shift with perpetrators and victims dying, we need to really, really reflect and reconsider how we teach about the war and the Holocaust. And when I say Holocaust, I really mean any victim under the regime, including some Germans who were imprisoned or killed by the Nazis. So I think it's a crucial moment, and I think we also need to understand that democracy is not a state, but that it's a process, and that we have to constantly defend it. And I think we see very troubling developments all over the world, and not even only the Western world, really all over the world, of extreme right-wing movements happening. And I think we need to defend our democracy, and we need to figure out how to do that on a daily level and continue to learn from what happened. So just because Germany has done important work in memorializing and facing up to its past doesn't mean that we're done. It also, though, doesn't mean that we should continue with our self-hate. I think self-hate is not a constructive feeling, or this cultural paralysis that I think a lot of Germans in my generation grew up with is not helpful, because it means that we leave the national pride or confidence to those who tend to be on the extreme right-wing spectrum, and that's a dangerous thing to do. So I think for Germans, we need to both understand that we need to continue looking back at the past, but we also need to learn how to love our country and how to express that love in public, because that's something that we did not grow up doing. And I think we need to understand who we are beyond the Holocaust, and also celebrate our cultural heritage that existed, centuries before the Nazis came along. And I find it, for instance, very sad that as a German growing up, I didn't learn old folk songs. We learned some old children's songs, but most of them, I think, were probably new from the 70s or 60s, from that time where Germans tried to shed all that heavy tradition, all of which they somehow rejected. and forgot that there was actually value in some of that tradition and in celebrating that tradition. Germans, I think, today are very individualistic because they forgot how to celebrate themselves as a culture collectively. They don't sing together spontaneously, you know, which is something that's often done in England or Scandinavia, I think. And they don't even know the lyrics to those old songs. And I think it's troubling because those songs can teach you so much about who you are. You know, they really teach you about human values. I'm not talking about German values, I'm talking about human values like steadfastness or faithfulness. And, you know, if you think about, for instance, O Tannenbaum, I mean, it's a very maybe banal seeming example, but the lyrics actually used to be how green, how faithful are your leaves, not how green are your leaves. So it talks about faithfulness actually, and we don't even know that anymore because the text changed and because we only know the first verse often of the lyrics.
In the process of researching, illustrating, have you asked yourself the questions how yourself would have reacted if you were part of that time? Is that a question that became relevant for you?
There was a moment when I actually thought about replicating the questionnaire that my grandfather filled out and trying, you know, asking myself the same questions. And I think it's a very difficult exercise because we're all shaped by the time and place we grew up in. And it's difficult to think about who you would have been at the time because you are so much who you are now based on the time and the knowledge we have looking back. I don't know what decisions I would have made at the time had I not known at the time, had I not had the whole, perspective on the Nazi regime. But I know probably that I wouldn't have risked my own life, considering that I have a child and that child needs me. But what I only realized through working on the book also is that there were many ways in which you could help that did not mean that you would necessarily risk your own life. And many Germans chose not to do those things. They chose not to help in those minor ways. And that is something that I can't understand at all. There were ways in which you could help by sharing food stamps, for instance, or warning somebody if you had information that that person didn't have. And I feel like it's our civic duty to do these things. And not enough people did do these things at the time. But I think the more important question that we should all ask ourselves is not what would we have done, but what are we doing now? What are we doing now every day to help preserve our democracy and to help those in need and to defend minorities? I think that's also a much more relevant question because if we only ask ourselves what we would have done, it's still from a very distanced point of view and it somehow removes the responsibility, the true responsibility. But if we shift the question to now, we can't remove ourselves from the responsibility because everybody always has a responsibility to doing something and to helping in the very moment that they live in. And I think that's the more important question to ask.